Fantastic. Thanks so much for having me, everyone. I'm joining you from San Francisco, California, and feel really lucky to be able to talk to you today a little bit about my journey and what I do. I'm on the faculty at the Stanford Center for Biomedical Ethics, which is in the Stanford School of Medicine. I was born in London, England. My parents are both immigrants to the United States, my father coming as a baby from Ukraine and my mother coming as an adult to the United States from Nigeria. One of the things that has really motivated the work that I do, I want to tell you by sharing a small story. My PhD is in education. Part of my work involved working with teachers, trying to understand how they understood students' abilities and their academic performance and causes for their academic performance. And as a thank you to the teachers that I worked with, I offered to help out in their classrooms. And so one day in the 5th grade classroom, this was a social studies classroom, and the school was located on the west side of Chicago. That was over 90% of students identifying as Black and African American, and over 95% of the students in the school on free and reduced price meals. So that is a measure that we use to identify individuals who may be low income. And on that particular day, the group of students that I was working with were asked to do a reading on Katherine Johnson. If you don't know who Katherine Johnson is, she was an African-American woman who helped to calculate the trajectory of the first shuttle, sending the first person into space. If you saw the film Hidden Figures, she was the main character in that. And so the students had gone and seen the film Hidden Figures a few days before, and now they were doing this reading on Katherine Johnson, and they were asked to kind of summarize what lessons they had learned from Katherine Johnson's story. One of the 5th grade students that I was working with is a young African-American girl. There was one thing in particular that this student had taken away, which was just because you're Black, you can be smart. The tendency that we have in our society to conflate race and ability, to see individuals from certain racial groups as having certain capabilities and abilities. And a lot of my work is focused on trying to disrupt or challenge those really harmful associations that we might have, that we do have in our society. I was really interested in racial and socioeconomic disparities in gifted education in particular. And I chose gifted education because that is a site where that conflation between race and ability is especially strong. There's stark underrepresentation of communities of color in gifted education. And there is this history of using gifted education as a space to exclude racial minorities. And so I was really interested in trying to understand causes for the continued underrepresentation of communities of color in gifted education, and the perspectives of educators on that issue of underrepresentation. And I was really interested in a particular area of genomic research, which is called social and behavioral genomics. This is the study of whether, how, and why genetic differences between human beings are linked to differences in behaviors and socioeconomic outcomes. Researchers study a variety of behaviors and social outcomes. This includes education-related ones, which is what I focused on during my PhD. But researchers have also studied things like sexual orientation or political orientation or criminal behavior. Another area that I focus on in my work right now is on multiracial individuals and how they get left out when we talk about race, ethnicity, and ancestry in genomics and in precision medicine research. I've been doing a project. And part of the work that we do here is pointing out that there are many challenges that are involved in addressing genomics diversity problems, but one challenge that is particularly neglected is the misalignment or the disconnect between how society defines and labels individuals, how populations are defined for research, and how research findings are translated to benefit human health. Multiracial individuals are currently often discarded from research that's happening in genomics, or labeled as other, or collapsed into a single category when there's a lot of diversity in who might identify as multiracial. And some of the work that we do is really pointing out how multiracial individuals can help us to move beyond this single racial group binary or categorization system that we use in much of our work. The final area that I'm really passionate about is community engagement. So working with members of the public, particularly working with individuals who have or represent communities that historically have been exploited by scientific research, to understand their perspectives on the risks and benefits of genetic research, and to involve them as decision makers in the work that gets done in genetics genomics. One example is a community co-design project that we worked with patients and their caregivers and family members within the Stanford healthcare system to identify some of the risks and benefits and considerations for an equitable program design about implementing or introducing genomic information for complex clinical conditions like cardiovascular disease. And one of the reasons why we decided to do this community engaged work is because we feel really strongly that engaging the community, when you think about prioritizing the research that you do or the health interventions that you might implement, this can optimize service for researchers and the academic community to identify what constitutes a harm or what constitutes a benefit of research. But members of the public, especially those who have historically been exploited by scientific research, they often end up shouldering the burden of downstream uses of the research that gets done. So they kind of shoulder the potential harms of the work. And it's important to include them in conversations early and often and upfront about those potential harms and about those potential benefits, so that we ensure that the work that we do, in academia, in industry, elsewhere, mitigates or kind of tries to minimize the harms while promoting or enhancing the potential benefits. Committees that review research proposals are designed to help ensure that the research that's being proposed doesn't cause undue, unnecessary harm to study participants. Federal policies that are supposed to guide how IRBs make decisions about research, they're prohibited from thinking about the broad social implications, downstream policy harms and benefits of research. And so that's a really under-considered area. In my field, social and behavioral genomics, people are really starting to recognize this because we've seen instances of white supremacists, members of the alt-right, using genomic data as evidence of white supremacy and white superiority. The Buffalo shooting in May of last year, the shooter cited a number of genomic studies as evidence of white racial superiority. And so I think people are starting to recognize that there's been a lack of consideration for those potential downstream harms of the research. The other point, which is related, are stakeholder social responsibilities for the ethical conduct and translation of research. So, again, we often rely on IRBs to help us figure out what's ethical or what's not ethical. We often focus on the harms and benefits to the people who are actually enrolled in our study. We're not necessarily thinking about the harms and benefits to communities that those individuals might represent or society writ large, and what our social responsibilities are to those communities and to the research that we do. So those are some of the three areas that I focus on in the work that I do now, looking at the ethical and social implications of genetic genomic research.